Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give just a moment here to let all of you cycle in, and then we'll get started. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to 5 Things You Need to Know to Fight Fraud in Your Organization. We're glad you've joined us this morning. Now, before we get started, there's just a few quick housekeeping items I'll go over. This webinar is eligible for 1 hour of CPE credit, and we're going to launch 4 polls throughout the presentation. To receive credit, you must answer all 4 polls and also complete the short evaluation you will receive afterwards. The evaluation will be emailed to you from a company called Prolera. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive the recording link and slides emailed to you later today from LSL, so be on the lookout for that email in your inbox as well. This webinar will run 50 minutes with 10 minutes Q&A at the end. Brian will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout the presentation and will do his best to address any unanswered questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question for Brian, just please put it in the Q&A box located in your Zoom toolbar. To find your Zoom toolbar, just hover your mouse over the top or bottom of your screen and it'll pop right up. Look for the Q&A icon. Now I'd like to introduce your presenter. Brian Gruber, CPA, is the managing partner with LSL, the largest CPA firm headquartered in Orange County, California. Brian provides audit and consulting services to cities and special districts. He serves as a technical reviewer for GFOA and is a regular guest speaker for CSMFO on technical topics including accounting, financial reporting, and internal controls. Take it away, Brian.
Great, thank you so much, Jill. I'm looking at this picture right now, and I realize I've been told many times that I need to get a new picture, that this doesn't look like me anymore. I guess I've gotten a little older and fatter, and maybe a few more gray hairs on the beard. But so next time I'm going to get a new updated photo for everybody. So today's presentation is about fraud. The reality is that fraud is happening to varying degrees in many of our organizations today. It's estimated that about a typical organization will lose about 5% of its revenues each year due to fraud. So for example, if your local government agency receives about $20 million a year in revenue, it's estimated that about 1 million your organization will lose to fraud each year. The median loss for a government, based on a 2020 survey by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, was that the median loss was about $100,000. The reality is, it's easy to think that fraud is not going to happen where I work or not with anybody I know, but the reality is it does exist. What are the goals for today? My goal for today is to bring greater awareness to fraud and fraud risks, and also to discuss some strategies and practical ideas for you to implement in your organization. I would view today as a win is if everybody today can walk away with one thing that you can do or implement in your organization towards fraud prevention. All right, so what is fraud? You know, when we think about fraud, all of us might put an image in our head of someone committing fraud, and this person might be some masked person or some hard-looking criminal, or just someone who has that look that I don't trust that person. But what usually happens is that the people that are committing fraud are the last person you would suspect of it. I'm sure many of you might have seen things on the news or whatever of examples of people committing fraud, and those people around them, when they're interviewed, they say, there is no way that I would have thought this person would have committed fraud. So what is fraud? Fraud involves deceit or trickery, misrepresenting, cheating, or it's intentional acts Today, we're going to be diving into occupational fraud. So occupational fraud is categorized in 3 areas. That would be asset misappropriation, corruption, and financial statement fraud. So asset misappropriation is probably what comes to mind for most of us when we think about fraud, which involves theft of an entity's assets. This could be property, this could be embezzlement of receipts or fraudulent payments, cash, inventory. The most common instances of asset misappropriation would be check and payment tampering, billing schemes, and cash theft. The second area of occupational fraud is corruption. Corruption involves bribery and other illegal acts, such as maybe kickbacks, conflicts of interest, illegal gratuities, which might be like gift giving for agreeing to do something, or economic extortion, which might involve demands for a vendor to pay to get a contract, as an example. And the last area would be financial statement fraud. Financial statement fraud would be intentional misstatements or omissions of amounts or disclosures to deceive users of the financial statements. It's the intentional alteration of the accounting records. Governments also have a concept of waste and abuse. Waste would be the act of using or expending resources carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. And abuse would be behavior that is deficient or improper when compared to a prudent person, to what a prudent person would consider reasonable and necessary operational practices given the circumstances. With that, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll for today. Our first poll asks the question, what type of fraud do you believe to be the highest risk in your organization? We'll give you a short minute to respond to the poll, and I'll share the results. All right, I think, should we go ahead and close the poll? All right, so looks like 76% of you said asset misappropriation, followed by second place was corruption, 17%, and the last was financial statement fraud. So statistically, you are correct. Asset misappropriation schemes by far are the most common. However, they're usually the least costly to an organization. Financial statement schemes, you are right, are the least common, but when they do occur, they are the most costly. So something to note too, though, for government agencies, the largest percentage of fraud for government agencies actually is corruption, followed by asset misappropriation. So typically, corruption occurs more frequently, is more prevalent in larger organizations than smaller. Typically, in smaller organizations, asset misappropriation is more common because smaller organizations might have less controls than a larger organization. And so smaller organizations might be more vulnerable to billing schemes or check and payment tampering. All right, if we want to understand and mitigate the risks of fraud in our organization, we have to kind of have some perspective or thought about how does fraud even happen in the first place. And one of the tools that I'm sure all of you are familiar with is the fraud triangle. And the fraud triangle tries to present in a picture form, 3 areas that contribute to higher risk of fraud. So the first area is incentive or pressure. Almost always, if a fraud is presented, a lot of times it's a result of some unreasonable pressure that's happening in a person's life. Maybe that person is in severe financial problems. Some sort of need is arising that is pressuring somebody is very often the case when fraud occurs. You could have that incentive or pressure, but if an opportunity doesn't exist, it kind of stops at that point, right? So in order to perpetrate a fraud, there needs to be that access to funds, right? Access to funds to commit a fraud. And lastly, we all believe we're good people, and we all want to do the right thing. And when we're tempted in this way, have the incentive, pressure, and opportunity, we have to rationalize our behavior in our mind. It's a common human behavior, but to have the attitude and rationalization that my actions were justified, I was okay. I would say the most common thing that you hear when a fraud is perpetrated is, I was just borrowing the funds. I was going to pay it back. That sounds like a good rationalization in somebody's mind. Sometimes people feel underpaid. They're, hey, I'm getting screwed. I'm just writing what I was wronged. Often that those types of thoughts come into people's heads when they're trying to rationalize fraud. Sometimes people say, oh, it's just once, just one time. The organization has lots of money. They're not going to miss this. Or maybe I'm thinking very high and I'm like, hey, I'm trying to help out someone who's in need. I'm trying to help out my spouse, trying to help out my family who came into hard time. This isn't for me. This isn't for my purpose. This is for somebody else. So all of these things kind of come into play in order for a fraud to be perpetrated. And so when we're trying to understand fraud and fraud risk, it's good for us to understand that these three elements are always present when fraud is committed. All right, what are some warning signs of fraudsters? So based on a Fraud Examiner report in 2020, they found that the number one red flag of a fraudster was that in 42% of the cases that they were living beyond their means, right? Living beyond their means. I'm sure all of us have encountered someone in our life where we maybe thought twice and said, that person has no business having these things or doing this. I know what they do for a living. I'm sure we've all encountered that, right? But sometimes we maybe justify it in our head, like, oh, well, maybe I don't have all the information. Maybe this person's spouse or family is very wealthy, and or who knows? Maybe they're just maybe they just have a lot of debt. We often kind of rationalize this in our mind too, and kind of justify and kind of explain it that way. But the reality is that when we see people living beyond their means, based on kind of maybe their occupation or what we understand, these could be warning signs that a fraud could be at a higher risk, right? What are some other warning signs? Financial difficulties. If we're hearing our coworkers and colleagues talk about financial problems and with ourselves or with our family, this could represent risk. Maybe unusually close relationships with vendors or customers. I'd probably be a little bit concerned if maybe my purchasing manager came to me and said that they went on a personal vacation with a vendor at the government agency. Might be a little more unusual, right, than just a normal professional relationship. Control issues, unwilling to share duties, right? You commonly hear that fraudsters never take a vacation, never let somebody kind of touch their work, right? Because they're trying to cover it up, right? They know that if somebody else jumps in, it's going to get uncovered. And so, that's a common thing. I would imagine that if I was committing fraud, I'd probably be pretty irritable. I'd probably be pretty defensive. And I'm sure this would contribute to suspicious behavior. I'm sure we all work with some irritable people. That doesn't mean they're committing fraud, but it might be an indication of a higher fraud risk. The last couple, wheeler dealer attitude. I guess I kind of interpret this as, somebody who's kind of like, hey, I can get this for you. I can do this for you. Or, hey, you do this for me. Maybe somebody who has that attitude could be a higher risk. And the last one is a lot of times you see that it's tied with a divorce, tied with a lot of family problems that are happening. So if we see these warning signs, again, doesn't mean that fraud is occurring, but it might be an indication that fraud risks are higher. So I want to go ahead and jump into our first example of the day. This is of a small government agency in the state of Washington. It's the Pierce County Housing Authority. And in the last year, the former finance director was sentenced for embezzlement. So let's take a look at the let's take a listen to the story.
At the Pierce County Housing Authority, they say it's an act of betrayal big enough to launch multiple investigations.
She was a long-time trusted employee who had worked within that department.
A 20-year employee, but Kova Campbell is now the former finance director and the focus of reports from the Office of Washington State Auditor Pat McCarthy, who says with unchecked access, Campbell was able to steal nearly $7 million worth of public funds.
It is a shameful breach of trust, of public trust. It was accomplished by deliberately circumventing accountability safeguards.
Sarah Walker is the fraud investigations manager.
It was at the end of July that we picked up on some unusual transfers that piqued our interest.
As they dug into the financial documents, investigators say they discovered significant fraud that happened over the course of 3 years. A routine audit caught the alleged crime and cover-up that involved using the names of legitimate vendors, according to Kelly Collins, director of local audit.
She created a fictitious invoice with the vendor name on it, and it just through the banking routing information that she perpetrated the fraud.
The money was supposed to help people in need.
At this point, we have no idea really how much you're going to be able to recover.
Now, housing authority leaders say they accept part of the responsibility.
We can see that there was not one mistake. There were multiple errors that we're going to need to address.
Like the agency's lack of oversight in the past that's now proving to be costly.
Campbell had filed a...
All right. So the facts are we have a $7 million fraud scheme that occurred over a 3-year period. Now, this is a small housing authority in Washington. The agency's annual revenues are about $32 million. So $7 million over a 3-year period was a lot of money. This was a trusted employee. She had been with the housing authority for 20 years. Okay. Looking into it more, she used the money to buy some property in Oklahoma. I think the idea was that she was going to retire there. But she also bought things like cars, went on certain vacations, some home remodeling, and also, had an interest in gaming websites. So how was the fraud perpetrated? So they mentioned a little bit in the story, but how it was perpetrated is that she created false invoices with known vendors. So the housing authority, for example, might have worked with ABC Construction as an example. So she created an invoice for ABC Construction. And then when that invoice got approved and paid, she changed the banking and routing information. So they paid their vendors electronically, EFT payments were made. And so she was able to change the banking and routing information from ABC Construction's banking and routing information to that of her own. And so that's how the fraud was perpetrated. She coded the expenses in the financials in the accounting records to things such as like investments, insurance, and maintenance expenses. So what do we kind of learn from this? So I can see from the facts and what was kind of uncovered is that there was probably some indication that this person was living beyond their means. There might have been an indication of maybe a gambling problem. It mentions about using some of the funds in gambling websites. I'd say that the Pierce County Housing Authority is probably a smaller agency, so likely segregation of duties was probably not very good in that agency. So a couple questions to think about, a couple questions, and also how they relate to your organization. More payments sent and received are being done electronically. So how are we controlling access to process and update vendor master file information, such as banking information? You know, when you really think about it, I mean, that's the new check, right? That's the new check stock. You know, in the past, we might have locked the check stock up in the vault, had 2 keys. Do we have similar type controls over changing banking information with vendors? Another question, you know, how else might this fraud have been detected? Well, I mean, I would think that maybe a 1099 gets prepared every year and sent to the vendor. If I was ABC Construction and I got a 1099 that said $7 million on it, I probably would have some concerns and maybe contact and reach out to the housing authority. What's the process? Who handles discrepancies and issues with 1099s, and who prepares those? Are they the same people that are doing the check disbursement process? You know, probably the big one in my mind is, you know, what are their controls over purchase orders, contract dollars? You know, what about, you know, are they allowing them to pay over the purchase order? What about the budget? You know, well, probably what was likely is she was probably the one setting the budget, right? She determined the budget, so of course it came within budget. And if they didn't have proper segregation of duties and levels of controls, you know, she probably just exceeded, you know, purchase orders or contracts, and no one was ever looking at it or following up. Now, when the payments are being made and the invoices are coming in, I mean, is the finance director the only person approving that invoice? That wouldn't seem reasonable for ABC Construction, in that example, that the finance director is the only person approving it. You want to also have people that are, you know, reviewing the work, that the work's being completed and done and proper. Those are different controls and elements that could have helped in this situation. All right, so what also do we know about fraudsters? So the fraud examiners in their report to nations in 2020, sorry guys, but apparently men committed more fraud than women. So men committed 72% of all occupational fraud. Not only did we commit more, but our losses, individual losses, were greater than that of women as well. So men committed larger losses than women, 150,000 median loss compared to 85,000 of that of women. Top departments where fraud came from include operations, accounting, and upper management. And it's not a surprise that executives produce the highest dollar losses from fraud. Why? Well, they had probably most likely the most access, right? With that, I'm going to go ahead and launch the second poll. So which city function or department, if you're not part of a city government, you know, use your best judgment, do you believe have the highest fraud risks? Finance, public works, parks and recreation, public safety, community development, utilities and other, enterprise, or other? Go ahead and give you a minute here to respond. All right, we got most of them in. Joe, you can go ahead and close it whenever you think it's ready. All right, so 60% was the leader in finance, followed by public works, 21%, and parks and recreation, 5%. All right, close that out. So as we talked about, fraud and fraud risks are present. So what can we as an organization do to greater prevent the risk of fraud? So the 5 components of internal control is what we're going to focus on today. And my hope is to try to provide some specific feedback in these 5 elements of internal control that will help you not only limit your exposure to fraud, but increase your fraud mitigation activities. So it's interesting to note, but research has found that governments have been found to be more vulnerable to fraud, as often governments direct less resource toward fraud prevention controls. So in our organizations, you know, what can we do? And that's what I want to focus on today. What can we do to move the needle in local government and do more in local government towards fraud prevention? So the 5 components of internal control, I'm sure you're familiar with: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. We're going to go ahead and jump into the first one. All right. The first element of internal control is your control environment. The control environment consists of our organizational culture. It consists of the tone at the top, our oversight body, and also our documentation and policies that we have in place in the organization. So when we think about our organizational culture, maybe a good way to think about our fraud risk exposure is to maybe understand the correlation between what is our organization value? What does our organization reward? What does senior management, board of directors truly recognize when we do it? Generally, that could help promote your fraud prevention activities, or it could help deteriorate, depending on how you answer that question. You know, it could deteriorate if maybe what's really recognized, the shown appreciation in your organization is get the job done at any cost, you know, speed over accuracy, or, you know, don't worry about the internal controls. These are things that get set in an organization that can contribute to greater fraud risks. Other things to ask yourself is, you know, what do we allow in our organization, or what do we tolerate? How do we handle if misbehavior does happen? Do we handle it and address it right away, or do we let things slide? You know, I'm not sure if many of you, the CSMFO recently had a conference, and one of the speakers spoke on fraud. And, you know, he asked an interesting question, which I think, you know, addresses this organizational culture, but he was kind of comparing the instance of when you speed on a freeway. Well, everybody speeds on the freeway, so it kind of becomes, yeah, it's technically not right, but everybody does it, so it kind of generally becomes more accepted. So asking yourself and asking your team at the local government agency, what is one thing that's happening in your organization that's accepted, but probably not right? You know, that's a good question to ask different levels of people in your organization, and might help provide some insight that you never really thought of before. So what's the tone at the top in your organization? What examples are the leaders setting? You know, what examples is the board of directors setting? How does the organization respect and value internal controls? Does our oversight body know and understand their responsibilities? Our oversight bodies are responsible to oversee the entity's internal control system. Do they know that? Maybe there's a need for some training. Maybe there's a need for more understanding and communication in that area. And the last one is policies and documentation. Most agencies I work with have a code of conduct, and a number have a fraud policy as well. But how quickly can you access that information, and how known are these policies throughout your organization? I'd say if the last time that these documents have been looked at was 1988, these are probably not very effective documents in your organization. So research has found that there is a 51% reduction in the amount of loss and a 50% in the reduction of loss when agencies had a code of conduct, had a fraud policy. That these two areas had a greatest impact towards risk of loss and duration of loss. So I would ask you, what does your code of conduct and what does your fraud policies look like in your organization, and how well are they communicated? Risk assessments. So do we have a process to identify, analyze, and respond to risks that are facing our organization? So larger organizations might have this done more frequently, and maybe this might be done through an internal audit department. But other organizations that maybe don't have an internal audit department might choose to hire an external consultant to conduct a risk assessment process. But if these two things are not practical for your organization, I would encourage you to look to do it yourself. Look at resources that are online. There's a lot of resources online. And I would also encourage you to brainstorm with your external audit firm about maybe certain risks and a risk assessment process that you might be able to gather. I would argue that something is better than nothing. So when we do a risk assessment, we should also consider fraud. We should consider fraud risks. So we talked a little bit about the fraud triangle and the risks associated with that, the incentive, pressure, opportunity, attitude, and rationalization. But we should also consider the types of fraud and what our risk exposure is to fraudulent financial reporting, misappropriation of assets, and corruption. So when we look at fraud and fraud risks, we should look at internal factors and also external factors. So what are some things that are happening in your organization today that might increase your fraud risk? Well, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of local governments is we're having issues with staffing and staffing turnover. And it's not uncommon to have a staff vacancy in different levels of finance department and other departments in a government organization. So how does this affect and increase our fraud risk? Chances are there's direct correlations there. Governments have been evolving just like other businesses and you know, everything else that's happening. And so new software systems, new processes, new approaches, new programs, new activities. These are all things that are happening in government that might increase our fraud risk. And so taking a look at that and understanding, are my controls addressing my fraud, is an important consideration. When I look outside the organization from an external perspective, you know, just turn on the news. What do you hear? You hear a lot of talks about inflation. You hear talks about our economy. And so how does that affect my organization's risk for fraud? Well, I mean, just go to the gas pump, right? And you can see that costs have risen in a lot of different areas. And how does that, how does that affect my susceptibility to fraud? You know, do my employees in the organization feel now underpaid now, and that, you know, they need to be righted because everything else is more expensive? That could contribute. You know, maybe, hey, gas is ridiculous. You know, the city does have a, you know, gas pump and there's not a lot of controls around it. Maybe that could increase the risk, you know, for that type of activity. Also, we've seen with COVID-19 the last couple of years, local governments have received a lot of new funding and funding sources, and also had new programs that have been put on. The next example I'm going to jump through talks specifically about some fraud that occurred related to COVID-19 and CARES Act money. And lastly, you know, we talked about it with that last example, but more information is electronic today than ever before. Have we relooked and looked at our risks associated with electronic information? So a couple of thoughts and ideas. So a risk assessment and also internal audit has helped to reduce the overall loss and duration of loss for a government organization by 50%. Now, as I mentioned before, internal audit and risk assessment are more common in larger organizations, but the reality is these can be performed at varying levels and varying degrees through any organization that exists. Let's jump into our next example. So the city of Stonecrest, Georgia. This is a recent, actually, this was like last month that this news report came out. So let's go ahead and take a look.
folks, we've got some breaking news from downtown Atlanta. That's where the former mayor of the city of Stonecrest just admitted in federal court he stole COVID relief funds that were supposed to go to struggling businesses. Now, Jason Larry pled guilty to 3 counts involving wire fraud, theft of government funds, and conspiracy. Larry agreed that he diverted at least $650,000 in COVID relief money, requiring some Stonecrest businesses and churches there in DeKalb County to kick back 25% of their grant money to companies he secretly controlled. His sentencing will come on May 2nd. Larry remains free on bond. Now, just 1 hour before his new guilty plea, his resignation as mayor became official. Stonecrest could hold a special election as early as March. We're going to have a lot more on this story coming up on Fox 5 News beginning at 4 o'clock.
All right, so the city of Stonecrest, what do we know? Well, we know the mayor and also a bookkeeper pled guilty to theft of COVID-19 relief funds. It was a $650,000 fraud scheme. It diverted money that was intended to go to struggling businesses and was taken for personal use. So the city of Stonecrest received about $6.2 million in CARES Act money. They had a funding plan for the $6.2 million. They were going to do some mask distribution. They were going to do some COVID-19 education and testing, and had some other programs. And they also had about $5 million of the program that was directed towards a small CARES Act small business program. And so the city contracted with an outside party to provide accounting services related to the COVID-19 money, as directed by the city, to be used for these small businesses that were in need. Now, the mayor, told the businesses that were receiving the funding that they were eligible to receive the funding if a portion of the monies were given to this separate company, this real estate investment company. So, for example, the city told, using ABC Construction a lot, but ABC Construction, we're going to give you $100,000 for CARES money to kind of try to help you during the pandemic, and as a result of the pandemic, how you were, injured as a result of that. But to support the community, 25% of it needs to go to this separate real estate company, and so 25,000 you're gonna send it here, okay? Well, the reality was the mayor was the owner of that real estate investment company, and so that is how he perpetrated the fraud. Working with the bookkeeper, he did conspire with that bookkeeper. He knew the bookkeeper of this separate company. And so actually, even before money was dispersed to company, he also started wiring the money directly to his business account. So what did the mayor use the money for? Well, he used it for paying off outstanding federal, state, and local tax liabilities. So there's probably your need and the need to commit the fraud. He was probably severely behind in his taxes, probably part of it, getting a lot of pressure. He also used it to pay property expenses, some political advertising expenses and dues. He also paid off his mortgage. He also paid some of his son's college tuition fees and rent for his son. So a couple questions to consider. So the city contracted with a third party to help out with the accounting services. And so what was the city's oversight of this, third party, or this contracted party to provide this service? What was the city's oversight? What should have been the city's oversight and involvement in this program? The other thing I ask is, I can't help but believe if I was a business that was receiving these funds that it might sound a little suspicious. I'm going to give you 100,000, but you got to give 25,000 here. It just sounds a little uncomfortable. Like I would be a little concerned. And so, did the city provide? Is there a resource or an opportunity to report suspicious activity for customers and vendors? Also, the last observation is it sounded like the mayor was the primary person determining who received the loans, and he was very tied to the program. Anytime you have somebody who's too invested, too involved, could be a risk could be a risk of the program. Someone asked, how did they catch the mayor? It didn't report that activity. It didn't say that in the news report, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that one. All right, so effective internal control should assess our risks in the organization, but it should design control activities to address those risks. Those control activities should be both preventative and detective controls. Some examples, of fraud prevention controls might be segregating duties. For example, maybe we identify a risk for fraud in that some of our employees are maybe doing multiple parts of a transaction that could cause a high risk for fraud. And so maybe as a result, we design control activities to segregate duties. Maybe we design control activities to restrict access. Does our payroll department need access to the payroll module and the HR module? Maybe not. Maybe we might identify that we need to develop some physical controls over the city's fuel storage inventory, right? Do we just leave it wide open? Anybody can drive up to it? Do we know who's using it, how they're using it, how much they're using? These would be examples of maybe some control activities. What is our policies to support accurate documentation of transactions and supporting records? What are our policies to support accurate and timely transactions? And what are some controls for management's review in the process? What advice would I give you here in these control activities? My advice would be this: put it in writing. If it's not in writing, chances are the control activity is not going to be implemented completely as designed, number one. Number two, I'd say it's more vulnerable to change over time. And also the interpretation of the person doing the control activity, whether that's valuable or not. And also as people change, maybe the way we implement controls change, maybe we don't understand why we're doing it. So my advice, put it in writing, make it clear why we are doing what we're doing. I think you're going to have a lot better result. Your control activity is going to be a lot more effective if people know why they're doing what they're doing and it's in writing.
Brian, we actually had a question. Do you know how they caught the mayor?
Yeah, I mentioned, it didn't mention in the news report how they caught the mayor, unfortunately. So the question, there is another question that was in there, is what type of fraud activity can occur when a payroll person has access to the HR module? So going back to the example of, that Pierce County Housing Authority, that was a vendor situation, but they had access to the vendor master file information, maybe the vendor's address, the vendor's banking account information, all this information. Our payroll records are exactly the same. If we have access to names, addresses, and we can alter addresses, we can alter banking information, we can alter pay rates, and we're processing payroll, that's making us vulnerable to our payroll department, maybe paying maybe former employees shouldn't be active anymore. It might be opportunity to change our own pay rates. It might be opportunity to change banking information for direct deposits to that of my own, or split banking information so that some of it goes to me and some of it goes to them. Or really the risk is some of these employees that are not active anymore, making them reactive. So there's a lot of risks that can be present as a result. Let's move on. Information and communication. So effective internal control. For internal control to be effective, management needs to have access to relevant and reliable information and we need to have good communication throughout our organization. Going to kind of move through here quickly. One example of promoting good communication and relevant information might be having good reporting lines to communication. Do we have an opportunity and a method, and do our employees know how to report if something is not correct? Do we have a whistleblower line or ethics hotline that is effective inside the organization, but also outside the organization from customers, the public, or others that might see or be witness to certain risks of fraud? So you all know this, but the most common way that fraud is detected is from a tip. So how does your organization promote and receive tips is something to consider. The second way, most common way fraud is detected is through internal audit. And then lastly, through management's review. So what internal audit, if you don't have a department, what internal audit type activities are you doing? And then also what management review activities are you doing that could prevent or detect fraud? Employees were the most common to report fraud, but followed by that was customers. So, like in that example of the money given to the businesses in the community, well, not per se a customer, but somebody that has a relationship with the city, what opportunity did they have to report maybe a suspicious, hey, give 25% to this person? The last thing is whistleblowers initially report fraud to direct supervisors. That's the most common way that's initially reported. So how do we promote and tell people that that they're able to and that they should report suspicious activity? If you have a fraud investigation team or internal audit, how should that be reported? And the last thing that I would say is to promote fraud awareness training in your organization is incredibly effective. What the statistics show is that organizations that did a fraud awareness training for its employees were more likely to gather tips, 56% compared to 30% for those without training. So do you have fraud awareness training in your organization? And the last layer of internal control activity is tied to monitoring. Monitoring helps make sure that our internal control activities are continue to be aligned, that things are happening the way they're supposed to be happening. And we should have both ongoing monitoring built in our system of controls, but we should also have a process to do separate evaluations. We're going to jump into this next case, this next example. This is the city of Bardstown, Kentucky, another hot off the press, just very recent. Grand jury charges former CFO with embezzling city funds, $762,000. Let's take a look.
Bardstown is known for its bourbon. That's why the city's budget is a lot bigger than other small towns in our area. But when city officials noticed hundreds of thousands of dollars missing, they launched an investigation. Now, years later, the former CFO, Tracy Hudson, is behind bars, and the mayor says he's confident they'll get back every dollar. FBI agents arrested Tracy Hudson Tuesday morning on one charge of wire fraud. According to court documents, Hudson took cash, filed false reimbursements, used a city credit card to make personal purchases, and more, to the tune of $762,000.
So it's not just a city crime, it's, I think, a crime against people from all over Nelson County.
Bardstown Mayor Dick Heaton says stolen funds were tied to city utilities, stretching far throughout Nelson County. It's a discovery they made years ago.
Yes, we've discovered it in September of 2019.
When accountants first revealed the 2019 audit, they found a large deficit. Linda Gray was involved in that audit and presented it to the city council back then.
She just, I think, took advantage of every way maybe that she could come up with to to take even more money.
Since then, the city has gotten some money back. Within days, Mayor Heaton said Hudson handed over $134,000 in cash. And they got an additional $350,000 through her bond as a chief financial officer. That's like an embezzlement insurance. The mayor says the total so far is $484,000 recovered and nearly $280,000 still to go.
We will be.
All right, we'll cut it off there. But a couple of facts that I was able to gather related to this embezzlement. This was another longtime employee of the city. She worked for the city for over 15 years. It mentions that she committed fraud through a variety of means, and very simple kind of basic things, just like, for example, filing false expense reimbursements. It made things like personal use of city credit cards, just kind of simple things that not elaborate scheme. One of the other things that she did was she made some additional retirement contributions to herself. I imagine that she had something like a deferred comp plan and withheld certain wages from her payroll to go towards deferred comp. But she, maybe she withheld $1,000 and then she sent over for her benefit maybe $10,000, for example. So that was another way she perpetrated the scheme. In addition to just, it says just making deposits to her personal accounts, her personal bank accounts. So clearly this is a person who committed fraud from a variety of methods, and probably is an indicator that there was just various weaknesses in internal control. The first thing I think about is just reconciliation. Talk about those deferred comp payments. How is that reconciled to payroll withholdings? Who did that? How is that reconciled and verified? Just supporting documentation and approvals. For expense reimbursements and credit cards. Where's the documentation and who's approving it? And lastly, access. Apparently she had varying levels of access to commit and also to conceal the fraud. Let me look here 1 second. Sorry. Let's go. All right. What are some other examples? Jill is telling me that I might have skipped the third poll. So let's do the third poll real quick. All right, so what is your biggest challenge in managing fraud risks? Training, education, budget and resources, too busy, time constraints, limited policies and controls. What is your biggest challenge to managing fraud risks? And Jill, you can go ahead and just close that out whenever you are ready. All right, not a surprise. By far, too busy and time constraints. The reality is that there's an investment in fraud prevention activities. And, we mentioned a little bit earlier, but governments, as far as budgeting resources towards fraud prevention, maybe trail behind private industry. Something that I would encourage you to communicate when you talk about resources being directed towards fraud prevention is the example that I brought up earlier. Hey, studies have been shown that 5% of an organization's revenue get lost every year to fraud. So that's a small local government, $20 million in revenue, $1 million in fraud each year. What sort of time and resources are we dedicated as an organization towards that $1 million? I could probably argue that a $20 million revenue government agency would spend a lot of time trying to spend $1 million. There would be a lot of that process to go through. Maybe we should be looking at fraud and fraud prevention a little bit differently. I'm going to jump into a couple of highlights just to kind of breeze through here. These are just some random news articles that I found within the last year of just different fraud that's being perpetrated. The first one on the list is that former Boston police sergeant pleads guilty in overtime fraud scheme. You know, I've heard a number of these different overtime fraud schemes happening, and a lot of times it's in public safety. Something to be aware of. In this particular example, over a dozen officers charged more than $300,000 in overtime. These were some officers that were directed towards overseeing. This was time that was directed towards overseeing an evidence warehouse. I'm sure you've heard recently, if you're in California, recently the California Highway Patrol has gotten scrutiny about the same thing, about charging overtime. And I think it was related to a particular project that they had to maybe patrol or to be available towards. So what's the organization's culture in this environment? You know, what is happening that is accepted but probably not right? That's probably an example of how that happens and how we have dozens of officers starting to do the same type of thing. As you can see here, this is happening every department throughout government. I mean, we got public works here, we got the water department, we got the building inspector, we got the parks and recreation department, we got the IT director, we got another building inspector. So a lot of different areas of local government are being affected. This is not just any one particular area. So I'll go with the final polling question. Who has the greatest responsibility to manage fraud risks in your organization? Jill, if you can launch that final polling question. Is it the governing body, City Council Audit Committee? Is it the Executive Management Finance Department? It is Internal Audit Department or other? Jill, you can go ahead and close that poll whenever you see it. Give everybody opportunity to respond. All right, so it looks pretty split, and rightfully so. I mean, in a lot of respects, because the reality is we all have responsibility and we all need to take responsibility for it. And so our governing bodies, our executive management, our finance team, internal audit, and all others throughout the organization all play an important role and have a responsibility towards fraud prevention. Just a couple quick resources for today's presentation. I provided some information from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners resource page. Check it out. There's a lot of good information there to help you better understand fraud and fraud risks. We utilize the Federal Green Book, which talks about the 5 elements of internal control and maybe some specific ways that you can look at your control and control environment to enhance controls. And lastly, you know, the FBI publishes cases regularly on public corruption. And so if you go to that link, you'll see, you know, a lot of cases in public corruption. And it doesn't take long to kind of see trends and see what's happening in local government. With that, if we have any questions that I haven't gotten to, I'll try to answer them here in the quick minute that we got. One person asked, does LSL offer fraud awareness training? I would encourage you to reach out to someone and we can kind of talk about how we might be able to do that with your organization. Yes, we could absolutely do that. Another simple thing is, I believe Jill's gonna save this presentation for today and send that to you. So I would encourage you to, you know, have people in your organization watch this. What is the best way to segregate duties in a small organization? It's good. It's a great question and a common thing that we see. But the reality is small organizations, really small organizations, don't have the people to segregate all the activities. So it puts additional pressure and emphasis on management's review and oversight. And I think what's important is that management, as part of management review, they know the risks. They know why I'm looking at this and why I'm approving this. And I think with greater awareness, we can have more effective management review and oversight. But that's how we really address that in small organizations. What happens if HR management does not follow through even after you whistleblow report fraud? So that ties back to the organization, the control environment, and the culture in the organization, and the support of senior management and the support of the board of directors too. You know, if we're allowing you know, things to slide or not be covered, you know, that's contributing to the tone in the organization. And so I think that just speaks to the need for involvement and role in senior management and also the board of directors. And I think with that, I think that's all the questions. So, hey, I really want to say thank you for attending today. I hope you took that one thing away that you're going to do at your government organization to help mitigate the risk of fraud. And just thank you so much. Feel free to contact us, reach out to us any way that we can help. We're excited to want to help you in any way. So thank you so much.
And to those of you that mentioned we closed out that last poll a little too quickly, I have your information in the chat and we'll take care of that for you. Remember, if you were looking for CPE, you will have an email coming to you from Prolera, and that is the evaluation. You just need to fill out that quick evaluation and then we'll get your CPE started for you. And again, look out for another email from LSL that has a link to the slides and the recording of this presentation. Thank you everyone for coming. We hope you enjoyed it and we'll see you again next time. Make it a great day. Bye-bye.